Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world. I've been away with work for a couple of days, so not been able to give you the very latest breaking news when it comes to leaks from Games Workshop for Warhammer The Old World. However, I am now back and it's time to crack on with investigating the latest stories that are starting to emerge. What's this? Well, you may or may not have heard that the story going round is from the Spanish community that the latest forthcoming FAQ for Warhammer The Old World, the contents have been leaked. Now, as always, massive caveat, until it appears on Warhammer Community, we can't say that it's true. However, what we're about to see does seem to line up quite nicely with some of the other rumours coming around. So otherwise, it's a fantastic trolling effort, or something that could well be realistic. Before we look at the things, however, a quick note. This was portrayed as being a leaked FAQ. And when we look at the content, you'll see this is absolutely not an FAQ. If anything, we are looking at an errata document, and we do know one of those is coming very soon. So that being said, and the usual caveats out of the way, let's have a look at what the future may hold for Warhammer The Old World. Let's start from the top. Close order bonuses is going to be restricted to units of unit strength 10 plus. So 10 infantry, 5 cavalry. I actually think this makes quite a lot of sense. Close order as a bonus, let's face it, it's a group of troops shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee, shield to shield, the heavy infantry, the disciplined ranks of a heavy horse. And if you've only got a couple of them left alive, they're not really going to be able to have that same effect. You're not looking at that shield wall type effect. I know shield wall's a separate rule, but you know what I mean. And it will mean weaker units, they're a little bit easier to pick off, not having that +1 in combat resolution. Don't have a problem with that. Next up, only infantry and cavalry can get a 2-up armor save. So, interesting, because this I think means characters on the big scary mounts, and we know from the previous rumours that one of the things Games Workshop was potentially, assuming those rumours are true, of course, going to nerf was characters on the big choppy monsters. So there's no way of getting your Chaos Lord up to that 2-up armor save if he's riding on a dragon, for example. Your Bretonnian Lord on a Royal Pegasus is going to be capped at a 3-up armor save. It makes them a little bit more vulnerable when they've already got high toughness and a barrel load of wounds. So it's not too bad. Of course, you still potential to get regens, to get ward saves and all that sort of stuff as well. So don't think it makes a huge difference, but it certainly helps reduce the staying power of Mr. Choppy on his giant beast. Next one, supporting attacks can only be made within your base movement. So we heard as part of the rumours that Games Workshop wanted to do something that deals with the threat caused by Linehammer to make the game of Warhammer look a little bit more like the game of Warhammer. I think this does go some way of dealing with it, particularly as I think the only armies that we really had an issue with, as far as I'm aware, when it came to Linehammer, was dwarves. Great weapon, armed crossbowmen, things like that, going really, really wide in one unit. Now they've only got a base movement of 3, so only models within 3 inches, and on a 25mm base, effectively that's 3 either side of the combat, are going to be able to get involved. Now, that's still potentially a lot of models doing a lot of attacks. If you've got something that brings 3 models into combat, then 3 each side of that, you're still looking at 9. And one of the things we've got to be a little bit wary of here, of course, is the bases are in metric measurements, and movement, is in a metric measurement. 25mm is not exactly an inch, so you can then argue, and I Wouldn't be surprised if some people did argue this, that actually that means they're bringing in a fourth combatant either side of that combat. So I think it's a good effort. Will it tone it down in reality? I'm not so sure that it will, because 3 inches is still a long old way, particularly if you've piled into the middle. Obviously, there's ways of restricting. If you're sending a chariot into an edge to maximizing, but not going into the middle of a unit, maybe that's the way around it. But I don't think this is quite as great as it first appears to be. Let's move on. Impetuous is now based on leadership. I like that. At the minute, it's a 50-50 chance that a unit's going to go charging off into combat when you don't want it to. It is purely a negative. You don't get the bonuses like the extra attack you get with Frenzy, for example. And the Impetuous rule does make certain units, Empire Pistoliers looking straight bang at you, entirely hopeless, because you just can't trust them to do what they need to do and to be getting stuck in with the right units. It's also a massive issue for Orcs. I think with, yes, animosity has gone bye-byes, but lots of impetuousness can cause you issues. Now, if you've got something that's leadership 7, leadership 8, bear in mind 7 on 2 dice as a leadership test is the most likely outcome. It does mean you've got a slightly above 50% chance with leadership 7, which is your average, of a unit not losing control. So improves the odds a little bit. It perhaps makes those impetuous units a little bit more attractive. Having said that, we now have the Chaos Dragon is going to become impetuous. Not sure that is a massive nerf for the Chaos Dragon. You're going to be looking at, leadership 9 anyway, so I don't really think that's necessarily an issue. Chaos Dragons probably want to get into combat, so they'll probably be declaring something. Anyway, yes, you can try and draw out that long bomb charge, get it to come in, fail, counterattack with other units, maybe pull it out into the open to unleash a load of gunfire. But it's going to have good leadership. There may well be a BSB nearby giving a reroll if we're looking at leadership tests. Yeah, I don't think this really reduces the power of the Chaos Dragon. Next up, Empire State Troops. They're going to get the Warband special rule. Now, Empire State Troops, let's face it, are probably amongst the most useless infantry in the game. Stat-wise, yes, they are better than other things like goblins, for example, but the special rules that those other types of infantry get really give them the edge. Empire State Troops, massively overcosted for what they do. So how does Warband help them? Well, State Troops in a nice block formation, plenty of them. They're getting that, of course, close order bonus at +1 as well here. Warband is going to give them a buff to their leadership in line with the number of ranks they've got. Additionally, they get to reroll the failed charge, which is actually now going to be quite interesting, particularly when we bring in one of the rules we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes' time. So Warband, I think, is a really useful buff to Empire State Troops. It's alright. Maybe it's not the most natural named special rule, but I think it's definitely a buff they need. If Bretonnian peasantry can get something that lifts them out of the gutter, then absolutely Empire State Troops need this too. Let's move on to the next one. Casting and Dispel bonuses are going to be capped at wizard level +1. So no stacking of Mortis engines. I quite like this. I think the double Mortis engine is pretty egregious when you're casting at +6, things like that. That's pretty nasty. So it's good to see that being toned down and giving people a fighting chance against a massive wizards in an undead force. Now, obviously, Mortis engines, they are in a legacy list. Does this mean that Games Workshop are starting to think about bringing some of those legacy lists into play? I don't really want to set those hairs running, particularly. But yeah, limiting those stacks of bonuses, I don't think that's a bad thing. Next up, poison is going to change from automatically wounding to a +1 to wound. Now, this probably impacts the goblin style quite effectively, where you've got a massive blob of night goblins with the spider banner to give them poison, chucking out a metric barrel load of arrows at 18-inch range, where every 6 that you roll gets a wound. That is a 6 to hit. Combined with Itchy Nuisance, combined with Red Sun Rising is the spell that allows you to reroll 1s to hit. You're really fishing for a lot of 6s here, and it makes big blocks of night goblins incredibly dangerous. And that's before you start thinking about spitting out fanatics, about netters causing issues and anything like that. So I think this might encourage players, hopefully, to move away from having that 90-80 model strong block of night goblins, which is ridiculously large, and helps chuck out some issues from the meta. Because let's face it, you're still looking at, with that Night Goblin unit, you're looking at a strength 3 weapon now, so instead of auto wounding, you're still likely to be needing 4s or 3s to wound, depending what they're shooting at. It reduces the odds of doing loads and loads of wounds with a big block, but it's still fairly powerful, it's still playable, just brings it down a notch. Next item on the list is returning to spells. This time it's a Vortex Pillar of Fire. Pillar of Fire is now going to have a random move. This brings it in line, I think, with a lot of the other Vortexes. Seems sensible. Pillar of Fire is just really good, and making it as good as other Vortexes as opposed to a step ahead makes sense to me. Travel Mystic Pathway, that's being changed to make it wholly within. Just reduces the effectiveness a little bit. You're not going quite as far. It is a spell that's known for being really useful. So again, it's just reining in a little bit. It stops it being quite as effective, a little bit less egregious and damaging for your opponent to have these models flying around all over the shop. And finally on the page we're looking at in front of us, we've got the Ogre Blade going up to 75 points. It's a pretty ubiquitous magic item. A big strength boost, good armor penetration, multiple wounds. It's doing a lot of damage when it gets through. It's a great character finisher. 75 points, yeah, that means it's now, I think, a bit less of a no-brainer on a combat character. You might want to start playing around with the magic item options a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, do I use it? Yes, it's a pretty much the mainstay weapon of my Orc Warlord. He uses it pretty ineffectively because I roll terrible dice, but it's a powerful option if I'm putting that character into big and important enemy characters, general stuff like that. Right, that's the first section of all of these changes coming up. Let's switch the slide and move on to the next part. And what do we see? Well, Chaos regen items are now only going to be on infantry and cavalry. Again, this is reining in that Chaos unkillable Lord on a dragon build. I quite like that. Chaos Lords on dragons, they're really difficult to deal with. I've only had the misfortune of really having to deal with one once. Actually, I got quite lucky with it. I got a couple of units of knight involved in a fight. One unit I think it held from a previous charge and forced to draw, allowing another unit to then charge in and tip the scales purely through combat res. Got lucky on a dice roll, rammed the thing down when it fled. This won't be as difficult to achieve now because getting rid of those regen items means the Chaos Lord on a dragon a little bit more vulnerable. Takes us away from perhaps having that single meta chaos list. Mixes it up a bit, makes things interesting. Always a fan of that. Which brings us quite nicely into the next two items. The Royal Pegasus for Bretonnians going up 10 points and Pegasus Knights increasing by 4 points each. Now, is this the right point increase? I don't know. But what I do know is the Bretonnian Flying Circus, it doesn't matter whether you're taking Exiles, whether you're taking Grand Army, whatever it may be you're doing with Bretonnians, we're seeing RAF lists. 2 big units of Pegasus Knights. We're seeing the ultimate killy character, the Bretonnian Lord on Royal Pegasus. We're seeing the BSB riding on his Royal Pegasus. Absolute beasts. This makes it a little bit more difficult to do that because suddenly those extra few points here, and if you're doing big units of Pegasus Knights, you're looking at an extra 16 to 24 points per unit, which starts to really then chisel away at the points you want available for other things. That's before those extra 10 points for each of your Royal Pegasus. So I'm not sorry to see people having to pay extra for these models. They are superb units. Although, I'll be honest, I have heard it argued that Pegasus Knights by themselves, they're not all that, because they're not the toughest, most powerful units. But as ablative armor supporting those really powerful combat lords, they are pretty tasty. And of course, with their speed, with their skirmishing, it does make it very easy for them to maneuver around the field and pick the fights that they want to be in. Talking skirmishers, skirmishers can only charge if over half the unit can draw line of sight to the target. There was a bit of a fear, I think, around the game of Warhammer The Old World becoming dominated by skirmishers. We see people with their units of like 30 Dwarf Rangers, for example. I think quite famously we've got like the Gyrocopter Dwarf list where there's tons and tons of skirmishers floating around. Does this help? Maybe a little bit. If you can get a little bit of cover in play, can restrict units from charging you. And it comes back to those Peg Knights as well. If they're hiding behind a forest with just someone just peeking out, or someone just in the woods to get everything into charge positions, then they're not going to be able to do that as effectively because they're going to have to bring themselves out into the open and put themselves at risk in order to get those charges off. Arcane Urgency. This is going to become 1 less to cast at a 9+. 10's quite high. It makes it one of the most difficult spells to cast. Most spells are an 8 or a 9 to cast. It is a very good spell, though, if it's used correctly. And I know people that swear blind by the power of Arcane Urgency. Moving a couple of times, really, really useful in the right hands. Now, mobility, let's face it, is renowned for winning games of Warhammer. And this plays into really that highest skill plays, I think, of moving your units around, getting them into the right positions to force your opponent to dance to your tune. Even if you're not necessarily setting up charges, you're setting up threats, you're forcing people to move in a way they don't want to move, disrupting their plans, making it really difficult for them to play their game. So this actually definitely makes this spell even more powerful when I think this really leans into the hands of really the top skill-based players anyway that are excellent with their maneuvering capabilities. Let's move on. Stupidity prevents casting and shooting. That seems fair. I don't see why this wasn't always a thing, to be honest. If you've got a wizard that's bumbling around because he's failed his stupidity test, to then be able to control the winds of magic and fire out spells left, right, and centre just seems ridiculous. Skinwolf buffs don't affect characters. Well, they're designed for Skinwolves, so yeah, why not? No issue there. Vortex is now dispelled from the vortex and not from the wizard that cast it. Yeah, the thing is out of control effectively once it's cast. This big remains in play thing whizzing around the battlefield. That's where the local magic is. Why not be able to dispel from the vortex? Seems eminently sensible and also helps tone them down a little bit, because you can't have Mr. Wizard stood at the back pulling the strings of the battlefield, making it virtually impossible to stop what he's doing once he's stepped back, particularly if you've got something with reserve move. Tomb Kings, that's a good example right there. Interestingly, impact hits are going to happen before challenges are declared. This means you can't use your challenge to suck out the impact hits to reduce the hitting power into a unit, either because you hit your overkill cap or because just less models are being removed. If you get chariots or multiple chariots bashing into your forces, they're going to take down some dudes. That makes sense, rather than all just stop at a nice safe distance and allow the champions to get on with it. It's definitely an interesting thing, and it makes impact hits, I think, more interesting and definitely something worth considering in a little bit more detail. Trollhammer Torpedo becomes cumbersome and strength 5. Trollhammer Torpedo, let's face it, it's a bit of a mainstay item, so having that now less mobile, when it's in a unit of weapons which are really mobile, is quite interesting. Strength 5 is going to injure things less often, so perhaps makes the Iron Drakes a bit of less of an automatic pick, because let's face it, you take your Iron Drakes for the Trollhammer Torpedo. Trolls are going to get motley crew. If you look at a lot of the models available for trolls, look at the Age of Sigmar boxes, for example, you don't get 3 models which are all equipped the same. You've got a bit of a blend of stuff. Now you can arm them that way. Is this changing the game? I'm not sure. But what it is doing, though, is making their box sets a little bit more playable straight out the box, not having to do lots of funky shenanigans in order to convert them. So, yeah, I think that might be potentially more of a sales thing than a game balancing thing. Flails are going to get Armor Bane 1 on the charge. Yeah, it makes them a little bit more effective. Flails are an interesting one because they're only really getting that bonus in the first round of combat, so they really do want to be charging. This just leaps into wanting them on the charge. What can get them reliably charge? Chaos Marauders on horses. That sounds like a definite thing. When it comes to the Empire list, you're looking at Flagellants. I don't think this necessarily helps them because they still suffer from that low initiative. They suffer from being movement infantry, so they're not going to be getting themselves into combat reliably. And they've obviously got Frenzy as well, so they're fairly easy to drag around the field. Exposed flanks going to there, so yeah, I think outside of Chaos Marauder Horsemen, I can't think of a time when Flails being better is necessarily an advantage. Maybe, and I'm no expert on them, maybe some Tomb Kings models might benefit from it, but few and far between. Likewise, we're seeing Halberds getting AP +2 on the charge, and this does become a little bit interesting. There are plenty of units out there with access to halberds, and some of them are pretty dashed quick. Whether they be High Elves, whether it be Chaos Warriors, so a big mob of those with halberds, pretty tasty. You've got Demigryph Knights, they come with halberds, or can do. And of course, we've seen if the Warband rule is coming through, and I mentioned this combination earlier, a unit of Empire State Troops with halberds are now re-rolling their charge roll and getting AP +2. This makes them actually a bit more of a frightening prospect on the charge. I think it reflects the reality of how they're designed to be big, nasty anti-armor weapons. yeah, but it's a pretty interesting thing. Obviously, with the Empire State Troop example and Bretonian men at arms, of course, their weapons can count as halberds or spears. So if this applies to them as well, it does give a bit of momentum to wanting that charge. They're still, however, movements infantry, so they do suffer from having to get pretty close in order to launch their charges. But anything that makes these blocks of infantry a bit more playable, a bit more interesting, is definitely going to improve the visual element of the game when we're seeing proper blocks of infantry, which is, I think, something that an awful lot of players want to see. I appreciate I've been going on for a while now. There's only a couple of more things to talk about. Infantry are going to get +1 combat resolution if they outnumber their opponent. Another buff for blocks of infantry. Interesting. +1 combat res. It's not massive, but these things all help tick up. It's why things like the War Banner are so useful. An extra +1 here, an extra +1 there. It just means your opponent has to work that little bit harder to grind you down. Obviously, it's going to make things like zombies even nastier because you've got an extra pip of combat res to get through before they're going to start taking any crumble casualties, etc. But again, I think it helps those big blocks of infantry. So if we're turning our attention again to that unit of Empire State Troops with their halberds, they've got the warband rule. So their leadership is now going up because of their ranks up to a maximum of 10. They're not going anywhere fast. They've got a bonus of +2 AP on the turn they charge with their halberds, meaning they're going to be more reliably doing damage to heavily armoured enemies. And they're going to get an additional +1 combat resolution for outnumber. Outnumber being one of the characteristics that gave a +1 combat resolution in the glory days of Warhammer Fantasy battles. Maybe add in the Griffin banner, so your rank bonus goes from a maximum of +2 to +4. You're adding what? +1 for outnumber, that's 5. You're looking at a banner for 6 before you even really start to think about doing any damage. That's a lot for your opponent to get through. Finally, infantry/heavy infantry, only +1 armor in melee if using a hand weapon and shield up to a maximum of 3+. This will only really help infantry that are using, well, light or heavy armor and shield. So maxing at that 3+ or maybe a 4+ armor save. It does give them a little bit more durability, and I can see a bit of play when it comes to helping out with things like Bretonian Foot Knights, for example. A little bit more durability, again, helps, makes them more interesting, a bit more playable. Chaos Warriors, another unit that will get a bit of a buff here, and it makes some interesting choices to be made. What do you arm them with? Do you want to give them great weapons, striking last, but you've got the big strength bonus? Do you give them halberds for that +2 on the charge? Or do you try and get them in, and if the game carries on, they're switching to their swords and shields, they're becoming more of a steady, heavy block? Something dwarves would really like, +1 armor save, making them even more resilient. There's lots of things in here, I think, making interesting reading when it comes from an infantry perspective. So it really does seem to be going into one of those, if we believe the previous rumours, core expectations, which is making infantry more effective, making the game of Warhammer look like a game of Warhammer. I appreciate that is a lot of news. There's a lot of here to dive into, and I've only really scratched the surface of it, but I have waffled on for nearly half an hour. So I shall leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful and that I've been able to offer some useful insight when it comes to these particular rumours. If you've enjoyed the video, as always, do consider a like and subscribe. It is the best way of helping a small channel such as this one. All that remains to say is thank you once again for listening. I am returned to the old world. Have a great day.